Hello, I am Mike Moliterno. I am the Vice President of Operations here at the Business Journal, and I would like to welcome you all to our Cyber Summit, Avoiding Breaches, Ransoms, and Costly Shutdowns. It is sponsored by the Better Business Bureau of Mahoning Valley. So as I said, we have a very big turnout today, so I would like to thank everyone for attending, and also a big thank you to our panelists. Let's do some quick introductions. On our panel are attorney Craig Horbis. He is a partner at Browse McDowell in Akron. We have Ralph Blanco, the CEO of Executive Computer Management Solutions, or ECMSI, and that is a managed services provider in Struthers. We are also joined by Robert Merva, the CEO of Avram Technologies, a managed service provider in Canfield. Steve Frankhauser, the Chief Legal and Privacy Officer at Burtis & George, an oil and gas company in Pittsburgh. Mercy Komar with L. Calvin Jones, an insurance provider in Canfield, and Paul Hugenberg III. He is the Principal and Director of Cybersecurity at RIA and Associates, an accounting firm and business consulting firm with offices across Ohio. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for joining us. Also joining me today is my colleague Dan O'Brien. He is the Associate Editor of the Business Journal. He spoke with the members of the panel for a story on this topic that is in our mid-July issue, which came out today. So he might be jumping in and asking some questions as well. So once again, thank you all for being here. And quickly before we get started, I also want to thank today's sponsor, the Better Business Bureau of Mahoning Valley. And also with us today is the organization's President and CEO, Carol Potter. Carol, would you like to say a few words and then we'll get started?
Thank you, Mike, and many thanks to the Business Journal for convening this important subject today and bringing the community into it. Since 1974, the BBB has been dedicated to building trust in the Valley's marketplace. And one of our standards for trust is to secure privacy. Unfortunately, as we take part in today's event, ransomware companies and their very top cyber lockers, they're meeting, testing, training, and growing their criminal networks to undermine your business's privacy. Due to the enormous profits from successful attacks, these criminal efforts are becoming more frequent and sophisticated, and small to mid-sized companies like those in our valley, like yours, are increasingly becoming targets. So I urge you to listen carefully to today's panel of professionals as they share a myriad of insightful expertise and resources. Thank you.
And thank you again, Carol. So first, I would like to begin with Attorney Horbis to provide us a little perspective. Could you please tell us how prevalent these types of attacks are, and then perhaps walk us through the process of what happens when a business is attacked in this way?
Sure. First off, thanks for the invite today and being part of this great group. To give you an idea of just how prevalent these attacks are, about 15 minutes before I stepped in this room, I literally got off the phone call with a client calling that just today got hit with a very large ransom demand from an Eastern Bloc criminal enterprise. This happened following about 20 minutes after the Homeland Security Investigative Services team showed up on site, and about 20 minutes later, the attack occurred. This is happening daily. As far as my practice is concerned, I am getting on average probably 3 to 4 direct contacts each and every week on various levels of incidents occurring, from smaller ransom demands, BEC campaigns, to very large scale coordinated attacks like the one that I literally walked into this morning. So these attacks are very prevalent, and planning for them is paramount to survival in today's business community. It's no longer if this is going to happen to me, it's when it's going to happen, and being prepared and understanding the real risks that are out there.
Could you give us just a little idea of the footprint of the businesses that you're seeing that are getting attacked, just to give us some perspective as to where these businesses are located?
Sure. The unfortunate thing is I don't believe there's really any business that is networked today that is that is completely safe and secure from these types of attacks. Obviously, the threat actors are going to be the more coordinated attacks are targeting some of the larger scale enterprises, mid-level. You're talking anywhere from 5 million up to 250 million in revenue, as far as kind of size of the companies that we see that are being heavily targeted and the coordinated attacks against. So everybody is unfortunately, if you have data and you have a network, you're going to be a target.
I guess, yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at, was that this isn't a problem that occurs elsewhere. This is something that happens here. Right.
It happens here in our backyard. We have offices throughout Northeast Ohio. We have an office in Camfield. It happens in our backyard every single day. The attack that happened this morning was actually a manufacturer out of Stark County. So this happens all across the region. I do deal with some very large global companies. But the larger the company, typically the more sophisticated their security teams and planning is. We see a lot of the manufacturing companies that have they have much smaller resources focused on the security side of things. And historically, manufacturers were in the space of IIoT, where you have industrial Internet of Things. So you have a lot of manufacturers who now have machines and floor plants networked, where they're monitoring processes and machine rates and those type of things, which historically were covered by plant managers who didn't have an IT background. Now you have those same facilities and plants that have everything from thermostats and controllers on the plant floor, which are access points for these criminal enterprises to maneuver their way in. And once they get a foothold in the door, it gets very difficult to get them out without some level of payment and demand, especially if they get the backups. This morning's incident, they were able to successfully get the backups, which is kind of the death knell scenario. That's one of the things when I go into my pre-planning kind of audits of security systems with my clients. One of the things we talk about is where are your backups? How are they stored offsite? Let's call them something other than backups, please. Call them purple fuzzy bunny. I don't care what you call them, but call them something that's not backup, because when these guys get into your systems, the first thing they're going to look for is the backups.
Well, and something I wanted to get to, I think you have sort of a unique perspective on this whole thing, because you actually negotiate some of these ransoms. Is that correct?
We do. We get involved.
Could you walk us through that and how that goes and how that takes place?
Yeah, depending on the size, sometimes the very big threat actors, in fact, the one this morning, we have insurance luckily in place for the one that happened this morning. Unfortunately, the demand is actually exceeding insurance levels right now, because it's a pretty large demand. In that instance, we've actually this morning's one right now, we're outsourcing the negotiation to a third party demand out of ransom negotiator out of Chicago that I've worked with in the past, just because due to the size involved. The smaller ones I will take on myself. And I work with a couple very good security firms in the region that we, once you have the identifying factors as far as who the threat actor is, we actually go through an analysis as it relates to who they are, working with local law enforcement, whether it's Homeland Security or the FBI Blue Team. We can kind of get a feel for how good are these guys? Do we know who they are? Have we seen them before? We kind of have an internal rating system, so we know the good ones from the bad ones. So we know if these are very well-known threat actors, and they have a pretty high kind of a Yelp rating, so to speak, on the bad guy level. We know that if we pay them, we're going to get our stuff back. And we know if we don't pay them, that it's they're gonna do exactly what they say. So once we understand who we're dealing with, we can gain access to the backdoor channels, whether we have to go on to a dark web browser that they point us to and start the negotiations there, or another location. We'll just start talking as far as getting bits and pieces of information as our own security teams are trying to break through the systems ourselves and seeing where they may have left their own backdoor. Sometimes we can find a backdoor in the encryption, and if we can somehow gain information to get at least pieces of the data back, we can lower the demand, because we can say, well, we got this back, you guys left a back door. I mean, these guys are good, but we can tell them up front, hey, we've got our own security teams. You kind of fight fire with fire and say, we were able to backdoor yourself, so we were able to secure a chunk of our data, so we don't need everything, we don't need the full encryption. And once we can kind of start working that angle, and also telling them, hey, if we can pay you quickly, with Bitcoin. I work with a company now, one of my security experts, that we started escrowing Bitcoin, because the quicker that we can pay these guys, sometimes the demand, we can lower the cost, the actual demand outlay, by saying, if we can pay you within the next 8 hours what you're asking for, minus a 40% reduction, a lot of times they'll take it.
Just real quickly, do most businesses that you work with end up paying the ransom?
It's tough to say. Obviously, if they're the good coordinated attacks, 9 times out of 10, we're paying something. We do have very good security teams that, if we have good back office offsite backups that we can restore, and we can keep them out of the backups, and we can scan and have a clean backup, then we can tell them to go pound salt. Unfortunately, the way that these guys work is they'll actually get in the systems typically months in advance sometimes, and they'll actually run their systems to infect your backups. And so that makes it challenging. Even if you think you have good backups, they'll tell you, well, we've been sitting in your backups for the last 3 months, so go ahead and try to restore, and we're gonna lock you down again. So okay. If they've had that level of access, you're typically looking at a pay situation.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to turn it over to Ralph Blanco right now from ECMSI. So, Ralph, could you tell us, for a business owner who's thinking, I'm pretty smart, these attacks, I'm not going to just click some link. I've taught my employees not to just click any old link in any old email. Could you tell us how these attacks are happening? Are they more sophisticated than perhaps business owners think? And, for somebody who's thinking this can't happen to me or this won't happen to me, what would you say to them?
Yeah, no, leading off with what Craig was talking about, for sure. The thing is, a lot of times I hear, well, we're too small, they're not going to go after us. The problem is they go after whoever has an open port to get into their network. If they could get in, and then they'll start figuring out. And like Craig said, they're in there usually for months, and they're snooping around and they're figuring out who you talk to. So you see all this email fraud that's going on. So yeah, everybody's susceptible. At the end of the day, I think the important part is to have an IT strategy, and you have to have multiple layers, because there is no one fix for preventing any of this stuff. So if you have technology, you have humans involved in it, there's always a chance that somebody's going to click on something, because they've gotten really good with the social engineering of how to get into your network. So no matter how many times you tell people not to click on things, they've gotten very good to penetrate with bad actors into the environment. We're going back to what Craig said. Could you expand on
that a little bit for just maybe somebody who doesn't know, kind of the term social engineering, what that means?
Yeah, I mean, social engineering is acting as somebody that you know. You see it all the time. Hey, your FedEx package is here. It looks like it's a package from FedEx. So you essentially just ordered some from FedEx. So they click on it. it'll ask you for your username and password. It's not really coming from FedEx. And then, they type it in and nothing happens. And what happens is that they install malware by getting your credentials. They're into your system. They install a little piece of code that's now starting to track who you interact with. And then they're just sitting back and watching who you're dealing with. So, there's a million cases out there on people penetrating based on email. So a good spam filter obviously is a high priority. But at the end of the day, you still have to have layered security, and you got to have tools that not only prevent, but also detect that there's something odd going on in the system. So there has to be some type of breach detection. Like Craig said, it's not a matter if you're going to get breached, it's when you're going to get breached, and how do you know you got breached so you can resolve the issue as quickly as possible. And also leading back to what Craig said, as far as manufacturing and other companies, anything that's on the network that's not part of your day-to-day, that doesn't need to get out of the internet, needs to be segmented off. So you get into manufacturing, and he's right, they get in there and they start, everything's tied to the network anymore. So you have to really look at segmenting off your backups so that there's only a one-way communication to your backups, where it's able to, your backups pulling from your production and not the other way. So this way they can't penetrate your backups, because once they have your backups and they're in there and they start encrypting things, then that's when you're in trouble. And another part for business owners to understand is it's not just backup, it's really recovery. How quickly can you get back up and running is the most important part, right? So you can have the data, but if it takes you a week, 10 days to get back up and running, you've seen these cases out there where people got breached, they have their backups, but they're still down for a week at a time, because if you don't have images of where you were before you had that breach, it's a long process to get you back up and running. So at the end of the day, I think you just have to have it don't matter if you're a 3-user network or a 100-user network or a 1,000-user network, you have to have some type of IT strategy, and you need to be looking at how you're protecting your business and how you're protecting your investment.
If I could jump in 1 second, Ralph. How is the pandemic and more people working remotely now, how has that opened up businesses to be more vulnerable to attacks? Yeah,
I mean, it gets tricky, because obviously you got to have VPN networks, and you can't just open ports so that they remote into their PC. I'm a fan of not allowing home users' devices connecting into the network. If you're going to let people work from home, get them laptops with docking stations so they could go back and forth, so that you can manage the security tools that are actually on that device. Because once you let them do, you don't know what they're doing with their home computers. You have kids at home, they're connecting. Now you're going to, if you create a VPN connection back to your office, now you're opening up, basically extending a network cable to somebody else's house so that whatever on those computers can penetrate into your network. So it's a lot about policy and best practice, and making sure you're doing standardization. Standardization across the board with your team is very important.
I'd like to pivot over to Robert Merva for a moment. Robert, you're also a managed service provider. For somebody who's maybe hearing this right now and they're going, man, I got to get on that. What does somebody need to be looking for in a managed service provider? I guess, what kind of questions should they be asking? How do they even know what they need?
That's a great question, actually. And I think part of the problem that I see a lot is that there are a lot of unqualified people in this business for some reason. Ralph could attest to it. We see it all the time. And it's a shame, but I think you need to do your due diligence, and you need to do your research, just like you would with picking any vendor for any kind of vertical. And I think you need to ask hard questions. And I think you need to, we use the phrase internally, trust but verify. You can trust that somebody's going to do a good job, but you need to kind of, back that up with some kind of documentation. And our best clients, the clients that we work really well with, are the ones who are really engaged. We like to see clients take part in what we do. It creates a dialogue. It creates some accountability. And it means that we've both got some skin in the game in terms of, what's at stake and what we're trying to do here. So I think that's hugely important.
Yeah, and I'll jump in on that also. He's right. There's really no qualifications from us being a managed service provider. Anybody could put that sticker on their door and say they're a managed service provider. And I think down the road, regulatory stuff, even for insurance agencies, they're going to want to see companies work with companies that are certified so that they could say, yeah, they know this company and they know they're dotting their I's and crossing their T's, because at the end of the day, what insurance companies are doing, they have the companies fill out information, but how do they know they're really doing what they're saying in the back end?
And Robert, I guess, what are you seeing with your clients? Are many of them coming to you thinking that maybe they have their IT secure and there are a lot of holes that they're not aware of? I guess, what's kind of the status of the businesses that you're working with?
Yeah, I would say that that's the case a lot of the time. We seem to run into maybe two types of clients, I think, in general. There's the client that's outgrown their current IT provider, usually because it's a guy that just does it on the side, and that person is not meeting their needs anymore. And that's hard. I mean, that those kinds of relationships work for a little while until they don't, and that's kind of the natural progression of business. But I would say that there's an equal amount of clients that come to us. I mean, I could think of some sales calls that I've been on where they've been more than happy with their current IT provider, which I always think is funny because I'm there, so I'm there for a reason. So that can't, always 100% be true. But I've seen some other IT companies do some crazy things, and I use the term IT company loosely there. So it goes back to. And it's hard because what we do is very technical, and what we do goes right over a lot of people's heads. And there is a certain amount of trust that we're doing our job, but I see a lot of things that just aren't being done right. The single biggest thing that I think I can pinpoint right off the bat is almost every client we've taken over has an IT provider somewhere that promised they were doing backups. And since we're talking about ransomware and we're talking about backups, it's one of the easiest things to verify that it's working properly. Almost no one does it, the verification, I mean, and almost no company is actually backing things up the way that they think they are. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into a business that they say they have great backups and we find out it hasn't been running in 3 months. Nobody's reporting on it. It's never been tested. That's a huge one. Your backup can say that it went through, but if it didn't make it to the other end in one piece, and it hasn't been a verified, tested backup, then it's completely useless. And I think Ralph will agree, it's not a true backup until it's been tested. So those are some things that we see quite a bit, where I think it goes back to engagement. They're just not engaged in their IT. And not to get on the soapbox, but I've been doing this almost 20 years at this point. I still see the same attitudes towards IT today that I saw 20 years ago. It's not a priority. I can't tell you how many times a business owner has told me that because it doesn't make them money, it's not a priority. And I don't understand that, because at the end of the day, IT enables everything that we do. And I always pose the question to them, if I took away all your computers, could you do your job? And the answer is always no. So it may be seen as a cost. It doesn't necessarily generate revenue, but that doesn't mean that it's not important and it shouldn't be prioritized.
Thank you very much, Robert. I think that actually will take us right over to Attorney Frankhauser. We're talking about costs associated with this, and let's talk about cybersecurity insurance. So this is something that you deal with. Is this something that is being overlooked, or could you walk us through kind of how that's kind of the status of that right now?
I don't know that it's overlooked. I think that it's underappreciated. And if I can wrap up some of what's been said before me to put this insurance question into context, it does take a village, and it is not a question of if. It is a matter of when. There is no doubt about that. And the one thing that leads to the insurance question is, if you look at the history of data breaches, whether it's in some form of ransomware, or if Target, for instance, which got its data stolen through an HVAC vendor, ultimately the question comes down to, are you prepared for an attack on all facets of your business? Because at the end of the day, nothing in business happens unless there is a sale. And if something interferes with your sales process, then it really doesn't matter about anything else. And insurance is key for two critical components. One is the component that Craig talked about, Okay, I'm in a life or death situation business-wise. I need a serious finance mechanism because I don't carry a bundle of cash around with me. And I need someone to pay this so I can get back into business. The other aspect of it that tends to be overlooked is while it's still relatively immature, the underwriting process to securing cybersecurity insurance will help better prepare your organization all across the board. Now, I'm not an IT person, but what I do know is this. There are highly sophisticated companies that have had highly sophisticated software and protections in place that have still been hit. So I'm going to give you an example, Mike, of an actual event that could have happened. In November of 2019, I was mugged in the parking lot of my office outside in downtown Columbus. The next day, I went into the office of the building manager because I wanted to view the video of my mugging. So I sat at his computer, which was in an open room, unsecured and unprotected. And as I sat and I looked at his computer, I saw his username and his password taped to his computer. Now, I don't care. I don't care what bells and whistles you have out there. If I have that type of information, I have the keys to the kingdom. So the thing that you need to think about insurance is, why do I need it and what does it do for me? The costs are enormous. I believe Robert talked about downtime. We all know about the Colonial Pipeline attack. We all know that they paid a little over $4 million. The fact that the Feds got a couple million back made big news. What's not making big news are the lawsuits filed against them by their clients for what they couldn't do and on the contracts they could not perform on in the interim period. So one of the things you have to do is you have to determine, how long can I stay in business if I'm being held up by ransomware? And that goes to Craig's point of, wow, why do we need to start a separate account for Bitcoin? Because time is of the essence here. So insurance provides the necessary finance mechanism. And I know of a company in the Mahoning Valley that wasn't insured, did get hit with ransomware, and said, party's over, we're out of business.
Yeah, and if I can jump in real quick, those downtime costs are huge. We've done 4 major ransomware remediations in the last 8 or 9 months. They were all for people or organizations who aren't normally clients of ours. And there's a little bit of a learning curve that comes with that. But we were able to get them to about 50% in the first week. And every single one of those projects took a month before they were 100% back up and running. Some of that was dictated by the network itself and what needed to be put back into place to get them operational again. Some of it was dictated by the insurance company, the investigation. But you know, I think people need to factor that in. It's not just the ransom. It's not just the cost of remediation. It's the opportunity cost that comes with being down for a week, 2 weeks, a month. You know, having an IT provider can help speed that curve up a little bit. I'd like to think that our clients probably wouldn't be down that long because we have good backups and we have processes in place. But we were in environments that didn't have any kind of IT support, really, a little bit here and there. And the restoration curve was huge. So that factors in.
Mercy, I wouldn't mind getting you involved in this part of the conversation. Could you talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing with your company, kind of the cost of recovery, and maybe how one of these attacks can impact the insurance premiums of some of your clients?
Well, it's impacting insurance premiums by at least 30% this year, and it's impacting healthcare by 80%. I have seen premiums go from $11,000 to $19,000 in one year for a healthcare provider. So it is impacting them greatly. People forget that the ransom costs, which is what you and the media always focus on, are the smallest amount of the damage that's being done. In the Colonial Pipeline situation, they got hit for a $4 million ransom. They had a $15 million cyber policy. However, they blew through that in no time with the first lawsuit from 500 gas stations that they weren't able to provide the gas for that lost income. So now they still have to restore their systems. They've got to bring in the gentleman to do the forensics work, figure out what happened, how it happened, get the system back up, figure out how much money they actually lost. That 15 million was gone, and they're probably in the hole another 15 million as they're working on it. So when I go out and talk to people, I try and make them understand the ransom is important, and that's the first thing they see, and that's the first thing they hear. But that is not where the money really needs to be spent. A lot of the insurance companies nowadays will come and do an estimation of what your costs would be to be down for 7, 14, and 30 days. So they give them an idea of how much they really need. And I think that's important for them to know, because everybody just throws out $1 million and says, here, let's buy $1 million of insurance. I'm sure that the gentleman will tell you $1 million, Craig will tell you $1 million isn't going to help you much anymore. I'm sure he's hitting 10, 15, $20 million in ransom cost alone. So it's getting to be pretty steep out there right now.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in and add, I think it's imperative that everybody is reviewing their insurance and what type of insurance, and making sure they actually have the coverage that they think that they have. I just had a situation with a new client 2 weeks ago, had a ransom demand, thought they had a policy to cover it, and it turns out it was a very limited data loss policy. It had no actual cybersecurity ransom provisions in it, and we have a denial of coverage situation here. So now the Bitcoin and everything else that we had to wrangle up, we had to come up with it, and they had to pay it out of pocket. So having professionals review your actual policies and what type of coverage you actually have is very much imperative. And the other thing is it relates to litigation costs and kind of some mitigation here. Ohio, we sit in Ohio, which is actually a very unique state within the data privacy world as it relates to the Ohio Data Protection Act. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Ohio Data Protection Act, but it's a body of law that got enacted. It's been in enforcement about a year now, where Ohio allows you to have, and it's voluntary, it's not mandatory, but it's a voluntary law that says if you take these steps and put your company in a position where you have an adequate, recognized IT security framework in place, a lot of the ones that I consult on are NIST-based security frameworks, which seems to be kind of the national standard that I like to push everyone towards. If your IT provider is not focusing on getting you a NIST-based or equivalent security framework in place and having an incident response plan actually drafted in a corporate policy in place, corporate privacy policies, all of these documents in place to help you become compliant under what ODPA requires. The if and the when the incident happens, if you are compliant under ODPA, you kind of get a get out of jail free card. You get a affirmative defense to the incident as it relates to civil liability. So it gives you a pretty big card to play that if you can show, and I think Ohio recognizes that it's when this is going to happen. And look, if we have very sophisticated systems in place and we've done everything that we think we possibly can do, and we still get attacked, Ohio is saying, well, we want to give you some mitigation here, as long as you follow the ODPA.
I'm going to chime in there if you don't mind.
Sure.
The affirmative defense is nice, but it still requires a lawsuit to be filed, which means you still have to pay costs. But I want to catch up on his point on the NIST cybersecurity framework. The NIST cybersecurity framework envisions a successful attack. And globally, there are over 20 cybersecurity frameworks. And if you can imagine data bouncing around the country like a pinball in a pinball machine, you may find the data is subject to all these different privacy laws that are coming into vogue. Colorado just enacted one. California obviously has one. The Commonwealth of Virginia, as does Massachusetts, et cetera. So we lack a national federal law on data privacy in just that category. So the best thing that you can do, in my opinion, is don't wait for perfect. That affirmative defense means something, and start out and get your programs together. You can always improve upon it.
And I'd like to add too, real quick, on the framework. You want to make sure, like I talked about before with layered security, but going back to disaster recovery, we all talked about that the timing is what costs is an additional cost for companies out there. And again, don't look at it as backup, but look at it as recovery. What does it take to get you back to the state that you were when you got hit? That's very important. And if you could get to the state where you got hit within a day, that's a very successful recovery process. So when you're working with your IT firms out there, just have that conversation. Yeah, it's a little more pricey, but it gets you, not only do you have a local presence of that, you also have a cloud presence. So there's multiple reasons to have that disaster recovery. So,
and let me interject here something. You had talked about having professionals that know what they're doing, and that's very important. I go out and I talk to accountants, lawyers, healthcare professionals, MSPs. People do not ask, do you have cyber coverage in case I have a problem? You would be surprised how many professionals in this county are not carrying that coverage. Or they have a small business owner's policy with a teeny tiny little $50,000 amount on it, and they think that's going to help them. And it's not going to help them. They need to be asking their MSPs and your CPA and your attorney, do you have coverage? Because especially with CPAs, I'm handing you my entire financial life. And I want to know that if someone takes it, that you've got some way of recovering it. And I think that's very important, that you know that the insurance people that you're working with, the attorneys that you're working with, the cyber security people, the MSPs, the people like Craig, they all have the ability to do their job. And people, and Rob has mentioned it, people don't ask. They just assume, and that's the wrong thing to do.
I'd like to get Paul involved here for a minute. Paul, you work with a lot of people as far as, well, I think we've already settled that everyone is at some level of risk. So there is nobody's at risk. This is for everybody. But I guess, how do you help businesses assess their level of risk? Which businesses are at a higher level? How's that process work?
So it's a great question. And what I'll say to kind of lead into it is we've heard a lot of conversation about recovery and backups. Recovering from a breach doesn't cure the breach. It just gets you your data back, right? You still suffered a breach. And so Stephen and Craig need to get involved to some extent because you've still lost data. Well, that is, a business owner makes a decision to back up their data and says, I'm good with a breach. They've exposed themselves to this other risk. So what we do is talk to business owners about what's valuable to them. Why are they in business? How much pain can they suffer? It can be as easy as a conversation about, hey, the average breach is, X, 100 grand to recover. Pick it. I think Robert and Ralph could probably give you a better number than I could. If you got 25 grand in the bank and poor insurance, you're out of business. And so you can start to frame risk in terms of, why are you here? What is it that if you lose it puts you at risk? What makes your business stop becoming a going concern? And then what threats do we need to kind of start to address to make sure that those things don't occur? So this risk assessment process looks at all of the things that Ralph and Robert and Craig and Mercy have talked about and prioritizes a business owner's ability to approach this in a way that's feasible and effective and efficient for them to do. Now, mind you, we're a NIST-based shop. We're going to install a NIST-based framework. We're going to point you to the NIST-based framework. It is a public framework so that the client knows exactly what they're getting. But the risk assessment kind of helps you prioritize how you want to implement that and over what period of time. A lot of times folks want to do a lot and maybe they don't need it. A lot of times folks don't think they need anything, and we identify major risks that they need to spend more money on. And then we point them to folks like Robert and Ralph to kind of get corrections.
Paul's data analysis is going to include the question of whose data are we talking about? Are we talking about data of the enterprise per se? Or are we talking about data that the enterprise collects from third parties, outside entities, human beings? Because his clients have an ongoing concern with remaining in business. Okay, I need this data to operate. And that's an operational question. On the other hand, you also have data privacy laws that require you to protect other people's data according to whatever law is applicable, if there is one. So when he goes in and he assesses data, not all data is equal in his assessment. That's why that function is highly critical to determine where your risks are.
That's one of the first things we do is a data mapping project when we go in and you try to figure out where the buckets of data are, because that's absolutely right. I mean, whether you're dealing with, CCPA, out in California, or you're dealing with GDPR in the European Union, or PIPEDA up in Canada. And we have a lot of, we're Northeast Ohio here, but you have a lot of operations that are global that go across border. So once you're up in Canada, there's a different set of laws there. We deal with a lot of PIPEDA, regulatory issues, a lot of GDPR issues that are just beyond the scope of anything that we deal with here in the US. And then once you have that incident, you got to then look at the bucket of the data that was impacted, and do you have to now have notification requirements over whether it's consumers or other businesses around the country? I've dealt with data breaches that I've literally had to go in and notify consumers in all 50 states. And some states have certain AG requirements. You have to notify the Attorney General's office. Some require you to have 2 years worth of consumer reporting monitoring that you have to provide to the victims of the data breach. So those are additional costs that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface on that occur after an incident happens.
You're spot on, Craig. So one of the purposes of coming in and sitting down and talk to people, which is what everybody on this phone call will do with their clients, is because, yes, data has certain value based on whether it's internal data, external data, customer data, consumer data. Commercial business data is not protected the same as individual privacy data, and it's different in California than Ohio. But what if that ransomware breach stole your intellectual property? That's not individual data. What if that ransomware that came into email and your initial gut response is, hey, I'm in Office 365 in the cloud. You can hit me, I can recover it. But what you don't realize is that your network hasn't been segmented and now your manufacturing line is stopped. Right. And those are places where you can turn into a direct loss of revenue or a direct loss of business function, and it didn't have anything to do with a social security number. So breaches are broad, and the threats that come into organizations are wide and numerous. And the idea to be able to sit down and implement a framework lets people know what they don't know. It gives them a box in which they know they can operate in. It allows them to kind of prioritize how they need to spend their money and what they need to spend it on. And it allows the owner or the executive team of the target entity to actually express and explain what it is that they're concerned about. It opens up that Q&A for the professional to interject what they may be missing or what they don't know is going on, in the environment. So these types of engagements where you're sitting down and talking about cyber ought to be a core component of a business's risk strategy that they address at least on an annual basis. You have to. I tell my clients every day, and I understand that some people may argue with this, but I don't know of another significant business risk that will put you out of business in about 15 seconds from now that you didn't have 15 seconds ago. Click on an email and rapidly expand ransomware across your network, and you could be done. It's that important and that significant. And so working with your IT team and your professionals, your legal and your MSP group, to understand that breadth or that universe of threats is extremely critical in today's world. You'll catch a virus or a piece of malware like you catch the flu going outside. You don't have to be a target anymore. You're just in an environment that is throwing it at you.
We have a couple of questions actually from some of the attendees I'd like to get some answers on, tossed to the panel here. The first one is, do most insurance companies cover the payoff to the bad guys? I'm quoting.
Most insurance companies will cover the payoff to the bad guys if you've got the right policy with the right coverage on it. And that's normally considered ransomware. That's what you'd see it under. And they will If you're working with, they have usually a breach team that will come in. If you don't have Craig or you don't have someone that you're working with, they'll bring a breach team in and they will start to negotiate for you. And they will pay out if they feel, and usually it's left to the decision of the breach team and the owner, not the insurance company.
Second question is, and this, I don't know what this is, but this is probably for some of the tech guys. Is High Trust Framework on the same level as NIST framework? I hope you guys know what we're talking about.
They have a lot of similarities. One's dealing with the High Trust is just certification to get you through like HIPAA compliancy, and it's just a certification. But they have a lot of similar standards.
So what I'll say jumping in here is that look, NIST is generally the framework that most other things are built off of. And that doesn't mean that they're 100% coverage. So High Trust is specifically geared towards medical. There's Graham Leach Bliley and associated financial services laws that are geared towards banks and student loans and financial dealerships, PCIs for credit card. There are plenty of alphabet soups to go around. NIST has really been kind of widely adopted as the, let's say, most comprehensive underbelly of these other items. Now, when you get into like a High Trust or you get into a CMMC for DoD, there are some very specific and sometimes onerous requirements that NIST does not have. So you have to be careful with just replacing a framework. You have to sit down and talk to a trusted professional about what your objective is and make sure that if you're going to adopt a framework that you're willing to live up to its standards. One of the things that Craig mentioned about Ohio data privacy is that commercially reasonable framework, widely adopted framework that gets implemented. Well, you can't just stamp NIST on the front of a policy and assume that you're covered. It needs to be implemented as a best practice. So be careful with just picking a framework.
Thank you. That is all of the questions that have been submitted. I think this has all been very informative and very, very helpful. I hope it's been very helpful to everyone attending. Before I wrap up, are there any other quick items that you, the panelists, feel that we missed that we could address quickly? If not, no? Okay. Well then, before we go, I am going to turn it back over to Carol Potter for some closing remarks. Carol?
So one thing I wanted to address, and we're going to go back to trust. The stigma of a breach or a ransomware attack on your staff, on your team, is devastating. So to create that culture of trust, you really do need to develop this, as everyone's been talking about, multi-layered defense. And you need to test it, as also has been referred to, because are your backups there? And then most importantly, you need to train the entire staff, including the executive level, so that everyone on the team is following the same security protocols and you're working within that culture of trust. It'll help you through this. And thank you to the Business Journal.
Well, thank you, Carol. Thank you very much to the Better Business Bureau of Mahoning Valley for sponsoring this. And thank you again to everyone who attended and to all of our panelists. You can read more all about cybersecurity and everything we've been discussing today in the mid-July issue of the Business Journal. You can see it over my right shoulder there. Just came in a couple hours ago, so hot off the presses. And I hope you all have a great rest of the day, and hopefully everyone who watched will take some time to assess your company's cyber safety measures and take what you've learned here to make sure that your businesses are as safe as possible. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for watching the video. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that little bell for notifications. And also make sure to connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. For all of your business news, visit businessjournaldaily.com. For all of your arts and entertainment news, go to afterhoursyoungstown.com.